Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting on the 5th of December 2022. Welcome to tonight's meeting. My name is Councillor Gary Thompson and I'm the chair of this committee. The Local Government Act 2020 enables Council to hold virtual meetings for councillors participating remotely by electronic communication. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting is being live streamed through the Council website to enable public viewing of the proceedings, including councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council website as soon as practically possible after the meeting. Should technical problems be encountered by the committee, then the meeting will be adjourned until resolution. However, Council is not responsible for any technical difficulties that may be experienced by members of the community in participating remotely in this meeting. Once the meeting commences, only limited assistance can be provided. I acknowledge that the councillors are all present on the screen for tonight's meeting. There are also a number of other officers in attendance who will be introduced as they present their reports. The purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. The committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with the reports, which include a summary of all objections received. Tonight we will be facilitating public submissions by electronically to hear from members of our community and or applicants. I'll call you individually when it is time to make your submission, and you'll be placed into the meeting to present your submission. When making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please do not repeat what earlier speakers have said and keep your submissions focused on relevant items and points not previously raised. Importantly, please focus your concerns rather than matters of history or detail in the officer's report. If you are opposed to the planning application, please advise the committee why and suggest an alternative approach which would satisfy your concerns. At the 3-minute mark, there will be a strict time limit for speakers. Whilst as chairperson, I reserve the right to vary that. I seldom do. And I will give a warning, hopefully by the bell, or I will let you know that you've got 30 seconds to conclude. So that's at the 2.5-minute mark. Moving on to order of business, Mr. Wee, are there any apologies this evening?
Through you, Chair, Councillor Watson has an apology this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Wee. Item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting held on the 7th of November. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion to move and adopt the minutes. Councillor Hollingsworth?
Circulated, thank you.
Thank you. And seconded, Councillor Gillies. Is there any opposition on that item? There appears to be none, so I'll declare that motion carried. Thank you, councillors. Move on to item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any conflicts this evening? There appears to be no conflicts. Thank you. So we'll move on to our first main item, item 3.1, planning application PP21/1168, 14 to 16 Denmark Hill Road, Kew, construction of 16 dwellings over 2 lots. This will be introduced by Ms. Kelly Caparosso, Principal Urban Planner. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I present UPDC item 3.1 relating to planning permit application PP21/1168, 14 to 16 Denmark Hill Road, Hawthorne East. It's noted the published agenda has a clerical error referencing Kew as the subject site suburb. It is proposed to construct 16 townhouses over 2 lots at the land at 14 to 16 Denmark Hill Road, Hawthorne East. The site is located within the General Residential Zone Schedule 3, adjacent to the Camberwell Junction Major Activity Centre and within the principal public transport network. The application was originally made for 17 3-storey townhouses, all with rooftop terraces. The application was advertised in May 2022 and attracted 20 objections. In October 2022, the application was formally amended under Section 57A of the Planning and Environment Act, which made the following notable changes: a reduction in the number of dwellings to 16, a reduction in the height of 4 of the rear dwellings from 3 stories to 2 stories, removal of the 4th floor rooftop terraces, and alterations to the building footprint. The application was formally re-advertised under the requirements of the Act, and 4 objections were received. Since the publication of this UPDC meeting agenda, an additional 7 objections have been received in relation to the amended plans. The following are key matters in respect of this application: the strategic context, neighbourhood character, offsite amenity, tree removal and landscaping, traffic and car parking. The subject site is located within the General Residential Zone Schedule 3, which is described as a moderate growth area. The zone encourages a diversity of new housing types, which include townhouses and apartment developments to facilitate housing growth. It is located approximately 15 metres from the Camberwell Junction Major Activity Centre and is within the principal public transport network. Council's housing framework plan specifically encourages new townhouse and apartment developments within this location. The proposed townhouse typology will suit a range of households and contribute positively to housing diversity and affordability in the area. The proposal is consistent with the policy context surrounding the site, which encourages and anticipates for moderate change. The subject site is located within Neighbourhood Character Precinct 32, which is described as having a highly varied character containing a mix of 2- and 3-storey buildings. The preferred character of the area specifically encourages the facilitation of a diversity of housing that integrates with the existing 2- to 3-storey scale. The proposed 2- and 3-storey scale of the development is consistent with the height anticipated by the zone and the neighbourhood character precinct statement. The overall building height at 9.87 metres sits below the allowable 12-metre building height specified by the zone. The proposed building height appropriately responds to the prevailing height of the varied streetscape, specifically noting the subject site abuts an existing 3-storey apartment building to the east and double-storey dwelling to the west. The proposed design response is supported by Council's urban designer, subject to the changes specified within the officer recommendation. They note the design has a modern interpretation of the existing materials in the streetscape, such as brick, and drawn inspiration from the existing streets character with a modern reinterpretation. The proposal complies with all design objectives sought by the Neighbourhood Character Precinct statement. The proposed development complies with the standards and objectives in relation to daylight to existing windows, north-facing windows, overshadowing open space, and overlooking standards. To the east, the proposal will not unreasonably impact on the dwellings within the abutting 3-storey apartment building. The proposal is set back from this boundary to comply with the side and rear setback standard, and landscaping has been provided along the entire eastern boundary. To the west, the proposed western facade is highly articulated and well designed to avoid blank, visually dominant blank walls. The elevation includes visual breaks and a mix of high quality materials throughout. The first and second floors are set back to exceed the required setback standards by the standard B17, and the council officer recommendation requires the third floor to achieve full compliance with the side and rear setback standard. The officer recommendation has further sought to maximise opportunities for landscaping along the western boundary to soften the appearance of the development from the neighbouring backyard. This includes the removal of services such as air conditioning units and water tanks along the boundary, and an increase in the basement setback to accommodate additional deep soil. To the rear, the subject site partially abuts a laneway and outbuildings. The proposed built form on the subject site at the rear is acceptable in this instance and does not abut any sensitive interfaces. Subject to the conditions listed within the officer recommendation, the proposal is entirely compliant with all Res Code amenity standards, and the proposal will not unreasonably impact on the amenity of the adjoining dwellings. The proposal is supported by Council's development transport engineers, who have determined the proposal will not unreasonably increase or impact on the traffic to Denmark Hill Road. The proposal complies with the required car parking rate for each dwelling as per the required Clause 5206 requirements. No reduction in the standard car parking rate is proposed, and therefore car parking is not relevant to this application. The proposed tree removal and landscape design is supported by Council's arborist. The proposal appropriately retains 2 existing trees which are rated as having a high and moderate value. This includes a 20-metre high pine tree, which is located to the rear of the site, and a 6-metre high crepe myrtle, which is located within the front setback. The retention of these trees is supported, particularly the large pine tree. This tree has a high amenity value and has been incorporated into an open area of communal open space, which exceeds the requirements of the planning scheme. Further, the retention of this tree provides a visual break to the development from the adjoining apartment building to the east. The trees proposed for removal are supported by Council's arborist as they are of low arboricultural amenity and streetscape value. Subject to the permit conditions outlined in the officer recommendation, the proposal provides for sufficient replacement planting opportunities, which include 4 canopy trees having a height of 10 metres and 19 smaller trees having a height of 6 metres. It is recommended that Council issue a notice of decision to grant a planting permit subject to the conditions detailed in the officer recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Caparosa. Councillors, we have 7 presenters this evening, all going well, 5 against and 2 presenting for. So to those presenters that are about to come online, once I've announced your name, a member of the governance team will enable access to you into the meeting so that you can make your submission. If a submitter is not present when their name is called, or if a submitter experiences technical difficulties, we will simply move on to the next speaker. Once all speakers have made their submission, we will attempt again to hear from those that experienced any technical difficulties. I'd remind all speakers that we have a 3-minute time limit per speaker, and at the 2.5-minute mark, I'll give you warning that you've got 30 seconds to conclude your presentation. Please commence your submission with your name and your suburb in which you reside. Our first submitter this evening will be Mr. Tim McPherson, and followed just after Mr. McPherson, Miss Dorothy Mary Murison-Travers. Mr. McPherson, are you online?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic, thank you. If we can just commence with your name, suburb, and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
My name is Tim McPherson. I'm representing my parents who live at 55 Campbell Road, East Hawthorn.
Thank you.
All right. Apart from the technical planning aspects which other neighbours will raise, our objection is the overall bulk of the proposal and the resulting negative impact on multiple neighbours. This proposal turns this residential precinct into the equivalent of a commercial one with the size of the development, particularly, and this is in relation to my parents, the rear southern boundary against the laneway. It turns a quiet, quaint laneway into a concrete wall that blocks the winter sun and closes in north-facing gardens. And I notice in the proposal, it only refers to, I think it's a September or October shadow. But as we know, winters are quite long and that casts quite a substantial shadow across the garden. We wish to have recognised and acknowledged the imbalance of the interests of ratepayers who are represented through the council. This development negatively impacts multiple ratepayers over the interest of one. And I suggest that is unfair and unethical. While we are not anti-development, and we do recognise there is a balance to be met between the enjoyment of one's residence and the enjoyment of one's investment, the excessive commercial gain of one ratepayer over the negative impacts of many, I suggest, is unreasonable. In closing, we request that the development be rejected in its current form and independently reviewed to address potential planning deficiencies and arrive at a mutually agreeable outcome that is sympathetic and appropriate to the precinct and neighbours. That's the end of my submission.
Thank you, Mr. McPherson. That's good timing. Councillors, are there any questions for Mr. McPherson this evening? There appears to be no questions. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. McPherson. Our second speaker, as mentioned previously, is Miss Dorothy Mary McPherson Travers. And following Mrs. McPherson Travers will be James Travers McPherson as well. Good evening, Miss Travers. Are you there? Miss Travers is on mute at the moment.
Right.
There we go. I can hear you now, Miss Travers.
All right. Yeah.
Fantastic. If we could just commence with your name and your suburb, followed by your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Tamsin Travers, and I'm speaking for my mother, Dorothy Molly Travers, who lives with my brother, Alex Travers. They're both here with me. And my other brother, James, is going to be giving a presentation after this. We basically agree with what Tim McPherson said. And we feel that although it's been improved by reducing the height of the rear flats from 3 stories to 2 stories, that it would be, I think, overall better for the whole streetscape if the whole structure was reduced to 2 stories. So we do appreciate the reduction of the height with the loss of the roof terraces and the rear 3 stories, but overall we feel that it would be better for all neighbours around to have it down to 2 stories. So that's really our input into it, and my brother will speak after me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Travers. Councillors, any questions for Ms. Travers? There appears to be none, and I'll just check with governance whether we can stay on with Mr. James Travers.
Jamie?
Good evening, Mr. James Travers. Are you there?
Jamie's can't hear you.
Good evening, Mr. Travers.
Yes.
We can hear you a little bit soft. If you can get nice and close to that microphone. And if we can commence just with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
My name's James Travers Murison, and I'm speaking on behalf of my mother at 51 Campbell.
Thank you.
And also my brother who lives there. So there's 2 people.
It's just very
Sorry?
hard to hear. Is it possible to increase his volume on our end, even if you can't?
Mr. Travers, are you able to get nice and close to your microphone?
I did have this tested before, and microphone was working fine with your council staff. They could hear me easily.
I think if you can just start your presentation again, I think we'll just have to listen carefully.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'm speaking on behalf of my basically the people living in 51 Campbell Road, which includes Alexander Travers and my mother. And my sister did very briefly speak, but I'm asking that I be given more than 3 minutes, as I'm speaking really on behalf of both of them who live there. So can I have that request granted?
Mr. Travers, I'd like you to contain yourself to 3 minutes or very close to that, please, if possible.
Well, I'm asking that you can extend it. If you can extend it, because there's quite a few points I have to go into.
If you can,
in relation to this.
Mr. Travers, if you can be as precise as possible with your presentation, that'd be great for.
If you could, I'll be as precise as possible, but if you could, extending the time. I also want to bring up a point about the fact that I wasn't notified of this amended proposal. So I'd like to bring that up as a separate point outside of the 3 minutes, because there's 3 minutes where or there's objection points, and there's also issues in relation to the fact that notification notice was sent to me of this amended proposal.
Mr. Travis, I'd like for you to just be very precise with your presentation, because we do have 3 minutes and you're part way through that already.
It's separate time to address the issue of the notification, the lack of notification that was given to me by council. So it's a separate issue to the objection.
Yeah, Mr. Travis, I'm quite clear we've got 3 minutes for your presentation. Please proceed.
So you're denying the separation of the time for the notification and for the for me being able to talk about the objection?
Mr. Travis, I was quite clear in the introduction to this council meeting that all presenters have 3 minutes each. If you can speak to both items in 3 minutes, that would be advantageous for all councillors.
It's not going to be possible. It's not going to be possible. But, I'm asking that you extend that time.
The request is denied, Mr. Travis. 3 minutes, please.
Well, I'm, want to issue protest notification, protesters to your objection to that. Okay, I'll start. Inadequate notice was given to object to the amended application and plans. I was not notified as a separate objector to the proposal at all, even by mail. No letter notifying me as an objector to the amended proposal was sent to me. All this despite sending regular emails to Kelly, the planner, asking about the amended plans and being assured I would be notified. Council did not notify all the objectors. I was a separate objector to my mother. A notice was sent to my mother, but none was sent to me, and it was explained to Kelly that my mother was extremely old and did not check her mail, has problems with short-term memory, and as a result, I never received notification of the amended plans, even though I'd been emailing Kelly each month asking her about them. So consequently, the first I heard of this was about a week ago, about this meeting being held, and we put in no objection to this amended proposal, and we got no legal advice. So I'm asking that this meeting, needs to be postponed so we have adequate notice to get proper legal advice and to consult, a professional planner about how we go about objecting to this. So that's to be noted. So I haven't had adequate time, therefore, to consult with professionals as to how to lodge this objection and how to prepare this to speak to you. So I'm asking that that this meeting be, or your decision be postponed until I've had this, because the notification procedures that were agreed to by your council were not adhered to. And specifically, I asked Kelly to notify me by email, and I asked her several times on the phone because of the situation with my mother, and she failed to do so. So,
30 seconds.
Yeah, well, I haven't even got into the objection, so that's why I'm asking that be concluded separately, and you at least give me 3 minutes to talk about the objection. Are you prepared to do that?
No, Mr. Travis Merson, I've been quite clear. You've got 20 seconds remaining of this presentation.
Well, that's utterly disgraceful and unacceptable, and will be brought up if this goes to VCAT. But the objection itself, there are issues of shading of the south side of the development, impacting sun on the laneway and the gardens and the south side houses, even with the reduced heights 2 stories, particularly as the development is so close to the lane. We dispute the shading diagrams given the development plan is not accurate in the winter sun and in the early and late afternoons, which will cut all the sunlight out. Development is going to add additional traffic because it's high density development, and despite underground car parking, any additional cars and guests, visitors, etc. will be parking on the local streets. It's too dense and too many apartments for the area to deal with. The increased traffic
If
of
you can
32
now just wrap up that presentation. Thank you, Mr. Travis Merson. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr. Travis Merson? Councillor Franco.
Through you, Chair, could Mr. Travis...
allowing an objection.
Sorry, Councillor
Yes.
Franco.
I'm wondering if Mr. Travis could explain the sunlight, the reduction issue to the rear garden and what the concern is in that regard specifically.
Well, the development is far too close to the laneway that abuts our houses, and it's I think it even breaches your required regulations as to how much distance a development can be from the fence line. So like I said, I haven't been able to properly look into this because this has all just been thrust upon me in the last week or so. And I'm still trying to get legal advice in relation to this.
So Mr. Travis Merson, just with regards to the question Councillor Franco's raised with regards to overshadowing, can you be specific in that response?
The 2 stories of the back property, even with the lowering of the 3rd story, it still is going to, turn the that laneway and the gardens opposing it in the winter. They're going to lose their sunlight on those gardens, and also the 3rd story that's being built with these roof terraces will impinge upon the privacy of our gardens, and because it overlooks them.
Thank you, Mr. Travis Merson. Councillor Franco, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, any further questions for our presenter this evening? There appears to be no further questions. Thank you for your presentation.
I haven't gone through all the issues that I'm objecting. There are issues about the trees being removed. There are issues about the fact that you're destroying a house that's over 100 years old.
Thank you, Mr. Travis Merson. Thank you. Apologies about that, councillors. Our next presenter this evening is Mario Carr, and followed after Mr. Carr, Ms. Carolyn Gill. Good evening, Mr. Carr.
Hello, my name is Mario Carr. I'm a resident at 53 Campbell Road and directly south of the proposed development.
Thank you.
On behalf of my family, we object to the proposed development, and I'll go into a bit more specifics than my 2 neighbours have regarding the development. So firstly, we object to the bulk, height and features of the proposal that are considered excessive and with considerable negative impact on the adjoining properties and adverse neighbourhood character impact. Our view is that council assessment doesn't adequately consider the appropriateness of the proposed development and the overall aggregated impact on adjoining properties and the neighbourhood. And even with the recent amendments, those key factors have not been adequately addressed. Regarding the neighbourhood character, this is something that I got out of the council guidelines. The objective is of the off-site amenity requirement is to avoid unreasonable and visible bulk to adjoining properties, to adjoining neighbours. The proposal does not do that, and further, there are various design guidelines which are to be avoided that have not been avoided as part of this proposal. They include large, bulky buildings that dominate adjoining dwellings, new builds that don't have appropriate transition in height between appropriate structures. And what I'm talking about there is the east-west and the north-south transitions to adjoining properties. Those criteria aren't met. In particular, the building height is non-compliant with the neighbourhood character guidelines. In particular, the centre and rear townhouses are significantly higher than the adjoining structures and does not provide a reasonable transition. To be compatible and sympathetic with the character, the roofline for the entire length and not just the street frontage would need to be similar to 20 Denmark Street. Denmark Hill Road, yeah. Okay, the other part that I wanted to raise is the extent of development. It states, it implies a 54% coverage, but in actual fact, over 80% of the land area will be developed, both with underground and above ground structures. That is further exacerbated in terms of the bulk by the amount of trees and substantial trees that we're talking about, 8 to 12 metre high trees that are being proposed along the southern boundary and east and west boundaries that are not there at the moment.
30 seconds, Mr. Carr.
Okay, 30 seconds. So next one, the southern boundary, I'll elaborate on that one in particular. The council acknowledged that the rear setbacks, the length along the boundary, do not comply with the requirements, but are proposing to accept those, which we do not accept. There's significant impact that has not been considered as part of the assessment. And essentially what would be created is the entire length of the southern boundary would essentially be a large vertical multi-storey wall that would be created both by trees and structures, which we object to, and that will have a significant impact, not on the laneway, but the properties to the south of the development.
Thank you, Mr. Carr, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr. Carr this evening? We do have a question for you, Mr. Carr, from Councillor Bigger.
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify, Mr. Carr, and thank you for your presentation. Am I right in that you just said that part of your objection relates to the additional trees that are being planned to be planted? So it's not the trees that are coming out; it's that the plans encourage more trees. Is that what you're concerned about?
Correct, because the council has proposed some amendments to the proposal. My view is that those amendments haven't been adequately assessed in terms of the trees on the impact on adjoining properties.
You're talking about the impact of sunlight on the trees. Is that what you mean? I mean, on sunlight on the neighbours from the trees. Is that your concern?
What I'm saying is there's the trees that are being proposed are large trees, 8 to 12 metre high trees that are being proposed along the southern, east and west boundaries that aren't there at the moment. They will be significantly higher. They will increase the bulk that is generated by this proposed development. They will satisfy an arborist, but they'll have a significant impact on the neighbours, when all the adjoining structures are much smaller, single level structures to the rear and centre of the property.
Okay, thank you very much. That answered my question.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. Councillors, any further questions for Mr. Carr this evening? There appears to be no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Carr, for your presentation. Our next presenter this evening is Ms. Carolyn Gill. Good evening, Ms. Gill.
Good evening.
Thank you. If we can just commence with your...
Thompson.
Thank you. If we can commence with your name, your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
My name is Caroline Gill and I'm in Hawthorne East. I live on Denmark Hill Road, opposite the proposed development. I would like to start by reminding councillors that because a permit can be granted does not imply that a permit should or will be granted. That's according to clause 65 of the planning scheme. It is up to the council to decide whether the proposal will produce acceptable outcomes. And I'd like to reiterate some of the points that have been made by the objectors already this evening. So council does have a discretion. The planning scheme includes a requirement to consider the orderly planning of the area. Now, there are a number of grounds on which orderly planning has been lost in this process. But in particular, I'd like to comment on the precedent that the approval of tonight's application would set. It does not, as has been mentioned, it does not appropriately integrate with the prevailing streetscape. Council Officer Caparaso spoke about the area being zoned for moderate change. This, in fact, councillors, represents a massive increase in density compared to the neighbouring properties and the properties all along this street, with the one exception of the heritage listed 1960 development. Thirdly, this street has a lot of has a lot of children walking to school and the adjacent kindergarten and childcare centres, and old people from the adjacent aged care facilities. Those children and old people generate lots of pedestrians and visitors, often who come by car. There are considerable traffic concerns which have not been addressed through the car parking provided in the basement car park. Certainly inadequately addressed. But in addition to those traffic considerations are the road safety considerations that are raised to this population through the development, and including in particular the basement car park for such a large development. I've spoken with recently elected Hawthorn MP, yet to be declared, Mr. John Pasuto, today in relation to this application. I'd previously been working with his predecessor. Based on our initial conversation, he expressed concerns in relation to this application and would like the opportunity to consider it further. As you know, he's only very recently been elected, so that has prevented that happening prior to now.
30 seconds remaining.
Road safety, as I said, has not been considered. My application tonight is for this decision to be deferred. Road safety hasn't been considered. It is one of the elements of, along with orderly planning, of Clause 65, and it must be considered. And there has been a failure to notify objectors to this evening's meeting. That objection was made by Mr. Travers. I'm aware of at least 2 other objectors who have not been notified of this evening's meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Gill. That concludes your presentation, your 3 minutes. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms. Gill this evening? There appears to be no questions. Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Gill. Our 6th speaker this evening is Mr. Joseph Indomenico. Mr. Indomenico.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and fellow councillors. My name's...
Yep, if we can commence with your name, suburb or your business that you're representing. Thank you, and your 3-minute presentation.
Sure, thank you. My name is Joseph Indomenico. I'm the town planner representing Den Hill Investments in this application. Firstly, we would like to thank the council for providing this opportunity to present briefly tonight. Likewise, each of the submitters who have taken the time to appear tonight and articulate some of their concerns that they've got around this application. We understand that with any application like this, it generates interest. What we have sought to do through this process to date is really respond and balance what are the strategic expectations for this site from a planning sense with some of the off-site amenity impact expectations, which are very important, that are also relevant for this site. The delegate report that's been prepared by the planning unit is very comprehensive, and we wholeheartedly support the recommendation that has been made by the planning unit, save for one condition, which I'll get to shortly. Rather than go through, I suppose, the particulars of the application, I don't think that's necessary. I think what I will do, though, is just spend a minute or so responding to some of the key concerns that have been raised by the objectors to date. It's fair to say that the first 3 or so presenters were really concerned about the interface at the rear of the site being the southern boundary. Councillors, I'm sure you've had an opportunity to look at the plans and really interrogate that southern interface. What you would have found, is an interface that is entirely consistent with the planning requirements being setbacks, as well as overshadowing, as well as overlooking. What I will highlight very quickly is the interface on the laneway presents as a single-story shear wall, not for the entire length of the boundary, but for a portion of that boundary. There is a setback above that first floor to the second story, again, entirely consistent with Res Code requirements for setbacks. And with respect to shadow impact, appreciate that there has been some concerns about impact at the winter solstice. As council will be very familiar with, from a planning perspective, the equinox is the tool to be used. And that's because
30 seconds remaining.
Sure, it balances the competing objectives of summer when it's good and winter when it's worse. It is the opportune time. With respect to some of the trees, as the delegate report notes, there is no removal of significant trees. Tree removal has been supported by the arborist. Traffic perspective, it has been reviewed by not only council's engineers, but we've had an independent review it too. So again, there is no concerns of traffic. There is no impact on street or safety for pedestrians or users. There's been a suggestion to defer this application. There is no need to defer this application. It's been through a thorough process. We respect the decision and we politely request that that decision be carried through from the council.
Thank you, Mr. Indomenico. Councillors, are there any questions of the planner this evening? There appears to be no questions. Thank you, Mr. Indomenico, for your presentation. Councillors, that actually does conclude our presenters this evening. The seventh speaker is not online, so we'll actually turn to matters arising back to our officer, Ms. Kelly Capriosa, to address any matters in those presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with just addressing some of the concerns around the circulation of plans. So amended plans were formally lodged under Section 57A of the Act in October. And given the extent of changes, it was Council's assessment that these plans should be formally advertised in accordance with the Act, rather than circulated with the agenda for tonight's meeting, which is also common practice that we'll all be aware of. The amended plans were formally advertised in October, and as such, it had to be done in accordance with the requirements of the Act. And the Act hasn't quite caught up with allowing for email notification. So a letter was sent out with the postal details provided on each objection. If those postal details didn't match the writer, council was not aware. We went by what the objection said and the postal information that is said. The Act does not allow, again, for formal notice to be done by an email address. However, the invitation to tonight's meeting is not a statutory requirement and can be undertaken via email. So when the agenda was emailed out to all objectors, those links were also provided. So there were two opportunities for objectors to object, and we've taken into consideration both those who objected at the formal notice of plans, as well as the objections that have come in after the council meeting agenda has been published. So that covers, I believe, the circulation of amended plans. In relation to the concerns about the laneway, the rear southern laneway has a character of high fences, garages, and vehicle access. The ground floor boundary wall is about 500 mil above the existing height of the fence along the laneway. So the character of the laneway is certainly not something that's intact, and the character of the proposal reflects that. In terms of overshadowing, there's been some concerns about overshadowing along Campbell Road, and in terms of the planning assessment for that, we have to go by the equinox, which is the 22nd of September, which is the middle ground, and the date that the planning scheme asks us to assess all overshadowing by. The shadowing from the shadowing diagrams provided by the permit applicant show at no point will any of the secluded private open space along Campbell Road between 9 and 3 p.m. at the equinox be overshadowed at all. So there is no overshadowing during the equinox to the secluded private open space of the dwellings along Campbell Road. In relation to the building height has an overall height of 9.87 metres, which is below the allowable 12 metres specified by the zone. In a policy context that anticipates 3 stories, and the 3-storey form does not result in any off-site amenity impacts and complies with all REDS code standards, subject to the officer recommendation about the setbacks for their western boundary in relation to the 3rd floor. In relation to the concerns about the visual bulk from the rear setback, the 3rd floor is actually set back between 20 and 30 metres from the secluded private open space along the dwellings on Campbell Road. So it's very well set back. And within consideration to the topography of the site, the submitted section diagrams show the proposal at its highest point sits approximately 1.8 metres above the adjoining apartment building to the east. And it has a stepped response, which follows the topography of the land, rather than having the one height throughout the site. In relation to the concerns about overlooking from the rooftop terraces, there are only 2 rooftop terraces proposed, and these are located to the front dwellings only, and they're approximately 50 metres from the rear boundary, so will not have overlooking to the secluded private open spaces of the dwellings on Campbell Road, which was raised as a concern. In relation to site coverage, the proposal has a site coverage under the required standard. So the standard requires 60%. The proposal has a site coverage of 54.5%. In relation to density in itself isn't something we can make planning decisions on. This is a double lot, and the townhouses have a good level of amenity. They comply with RES code generally. And also noting that they have an area of secluded private open space on the ground floor. The standard actually allows for secluded private open space to be 8 square meters. So in this instance, there's ground floor access from the living room. So this provides a sense of spaciousness and also for the internal amenity of residents. In relation to road safety, the provision of basement car parking and removes one crossover. So we're improving the amenity of the pedestrian thoroughfare, and we're retaining a street tree by having one crossover. So there's no car parking reduction, as I've previously said. In terms of the traffic consideration, the application was entirely supported by Council's development traffic engineers and has certainly been considered as part of this application. Thank you.
Thank you for those responses. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? I do got Councillor Hollingsworth, followed by Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Capriotto, I just wanted to ask if you're able to confirm if there was any email correspondence sent to Mr. Ian Macpherson Travers, as he indicated he was representative of his mother, who is aged and has some memory issues.
Thank you. Yes, there was lots of correspondence with I was understanding that he had lots of questions about the application and want clarification on the process, which I provided. That was informal. When it comes to providing information in accordance with the Act, we go by the objection and not by informal correspondence. But his email address was certainly kept for when we circulated the UPDC meeting. It just wasn't provided on the objection, and the postal address was provided was his mother's postal address, which we sent the letter to.
Thank you. So he wasn't in receipt of an email?
He was in receipt of an email in relation to this invitation today. For tonight.
He was. Okay. Look, thank you for clarification. And sorry, just one more question, if I may. With regard to page 5 of the report, with the officer recommendation and the amended plans required, item A talks about the rooftop lift shaft either set back to align with the stairs or removed. Is there a preferred position on that?
Thank you. The way that the condition has been drafted is to allow some flexibility on how the applicant plans to achieve that. It's not that we don't want the rooftop lift at all. It's just that we don't want it in the position which protrudes forward of the roofed area. We want it to be set back more in line with where it is in Townhouse 1. So by drafting that condition, we want to allow the permit applicant to set it back or remove it, whatever they can do to achieve that. But the objective is for it not to be positioned forward of the rooftop area.
Right, thank you. And do you know if the applicant has a willingness to support that recommendation or amendment as a stipulation?
My understanding is that they don't support it because of some private agreements they have with the landowner. But it is something that has come out of the urban design referral comments, and the urban designer has described them as poorly integrated into the facade and presenting visually intrusive into an otherwise well-configured streetscape. So whilst the permit applicant might not welcome that condition, it can be accommodated, and I believe that we have provided some flexibility on how they can accommodate that, and whether they change their private agreement or they redesign that particular internal layout of that dwelling.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. I've got Councillor Stavro, and was that Councillor Sinfield that put your hand up? No? Councillor Park, I just saw a movement there. Councillor Franco, I can see. Thank you, Councillor Stavro.
Through you, Councillor Thompson. Excuse me. Ms. Cavaraso, just wanted to get a better understanding. I haven't visited the site, but I've looked at the drawings in terms of the height comparison of the proposed building or buildings and the next door post-war flats. Just to give it in terms of height comparisons and kind of coverage of the entire site.
Thank you. As viewed from the street, the proposal presents as 2 stories with a recessed 3rd floor. The post-war flats that are next door are actually a significant graded heritage building, and the proposal is not forward of that building and is not higher than that building. In terms of the travelling through the land, the topography of the land is higher at the rear, and the proposal has been stepped to sort of respond to that. Back in when the post-war flats were built, they probably just excavated and built the one height. In this instance, it's been stepped, and that also allows the retention of the tree rather than excavating down. So at the highest point, which is centrally to the site, the proposal is about 1.8 metres higher than the post-war flats next door. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Just a little bit more clarification then. At that highest point, and I don't know how to sort of frame it in an easy way, how much of that peak and around the peak would actually be higher than the post-war flats?
So at the highest point, so I've taken that dimension from the section diagrams where you've got bedroom 4 and 3. So if you look at the plans, it's sort of broken into 3 forms in the elevation. So where that 3-story form is, it then tapers down to 2 stories towards the rear. So that's where I've taken that section diagram from, with the assessment that it's 1.8 metres higher than the neighbouring flats. So it's certainly not throughout the site. The 3rd floor section is centrally sited within the site, and a portion of that will be higher than the post-war flats, but continues to be res code compliant.
Yeah. And from the visual of the areas that you can see it publicly, you wouldn't be able to see that height protrusion.
No, it's quite well set back. It's set back, I'll just scale it now, but it's well set back from the street behind the front dwellings, rooftop terraces. So about 18 metres from the street. So maybe in a small oblique section, but it certainly won't be overwhelming.
Thank you, Ms. Caparoso.
Thank you, Councillor Stavry. Councillor Franco.
Thank you. Councillor Stavry has asked a couple of the questions I had, but I've got a couple more. In relation to, one of the concerns is the impact of on-street parking. To what extent do we have current parking restrictions in the street? And if we don't, what guarantee or what probability is there that we can have on-street restrictions prior to the development going ahead rather than after?
Thank you. Look, given that there's no requirement for visitor parking in the scheme and there's no permit trigger for the reduction of car parking is not a permit trigger. And I'm not sure what the car parking restrictions are on Denmark Hill Road, but given that there's no statutory weight in car parking, it's not something that we can consider in terms of whether or not it's acceptable. It's a statutory requirement and it has been met.
Just to clarify, so the statutory requirement being the provision of the number of off-street car spaces for the development and not waiving the minimum, and that's the extent of the statutory requirement. Is that correct?
Correct. This application does not waive any car parking. It provides all required car parking on site, and that is required by the scheme. It's a number that's set by the scheme, and there's no permit trigger in relation to it. So it really shouldn't be considered.
So it'd be a completely separate matter, would it, for the our Transport and Traffic Department to assess the on-street parking restrictions that currently exist and whether additional restrictions are warranted prior to the completion, assuming this development's approved and actually constructed. Is that correct?
The availability of on-street car parking on this site would be a separate consideration to the appropriateness of this development application.
Thank you. Separate question in relation to, I'll just go through some of the things that came up. One speaker, I think it was Mr. Carr, made the point that 80% of the site was actually being covered. Could you revisit how much of the site is actually being covered and whether that claim relates to the use of underground spaces or whether there is any accuracy to that?
Thank you. In terms of the site coverage has, the proposal has a site coverage of 54.5% and a garden area of 36.4%. And the definitions of that are prescribed by the scheme. In terms of whether there's a basement underneath that, is a bit of a separate matter. You can still achieve garden area above a basement, but in the officer recommendation, I have sought to increase the deep soil planting opportunities, which I guess is a bit separate to the garden area. The garden area will remain the same, but the deep soil will be improved. So you can have site coverage and garden area above a basement, and it still counts as garden area and site coverage in terms of the requirements of the planning scheme.
Thank you for explaining that. In relation to privacy impacts on those to the south, I noted you mentioned that the decks were not overlooking the south, but to the north. Is that correct? But is there any windows to the south? I was just trying to review the plans during the discussion. I'm struggling on my iPad as we're having the conversation. Is there screening or any of the like? I think this was an issue raised by Mr. Travers and Mr. Carr as well.
Thank you. To the southern elevation, there's 4 windows proposed. All those windows are fixed obscure glazing to 1.7 metres above the finished floor level. which complies with the overlooking standard.
Thank you. And the transition across each site, I mean, it's typically one story. Is that reasonable? It does comply the current proposal in relation to the transition requirements. Is that correct?
Sorry, I might just ask clarification on transition.
Sorry. Transition in the sense under the planning scheme, I understand that the objective is to try and have a maximum of one story increase in terms of the properties that you're abutting. Is that correct? And if so, if that is correct, does the current proposal comply with that?
I think I understand, thank you. There is a neighbourhood character guideline, which is common within the neighbourhood character precinct statements, which seeks to ensure that development does provide a transition. This neighbourhood character precinct statement is actually quite lax with the requirements that it says, and it specifies the development is not to be over 3 stories. In terms of from a streetscape perspective, the proposal does provide that transition between the 3-story flats and the 2-story form as well as viewed from the street.
A separate issue that was in a written submission from Ms. Gill was the lack of availability of electrical vehicle charging spots. Is that the case? And do we know? And can we require it?
Thank you. We certainly ask for an environmental sustainable design report. In terms of EV charging, I have to double check, but the sustainable design report is we ask for a BESS report, and in the BESS report there's certain ways that you can achieve the best practice, and that might be through EV charging, that might be through solar panels. There's a number of ways that you can achieve the compliance with the best outcomes, and we have asked for a sustainable design report as well. In terms of whether they've proposed EV chargers, I'll just have to maybe double check and get back to you. I'm not sure off the top of my head. We can't, there's no provision in the planning scheme to require them yet. It's definitely something that I think will come soon, but isn't there yet. But they definitely need to comply with the best requirements.
And a final question just on process. The sustainability report that we can and do request for certain developments, when does that kick in? For what types of developments does that kick in, and why in this case? And to what extent are passive sustainability requirements featured in that? Because it might be reasonable to assume they should be the first point of call for good sustainability.
Thank you. So there's different, for multi-unit developments, generally all multi-unit developments now require some kind of sustainable design assessment to be provided, and whether that's as comprehensive as a BESS report, or whether that's something that's a bit more like a water sensitive urban design report. That's also something that's very common in multi-unit developments. In this instance, they need to achieve 50% in the categories relating to energy and water, and 100% for stormwater capacity, with a 6.5 star average rating. So I believe 6.5 stars is the top of what we can ask for. That's what we've asked for in this instance.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. There appears to be no further questions from councillors. So the councillors, I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. The officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. And to assist Councillor Gillies, is there a seconder to that motion? Councillor Addis just got a hand up ahead. And is there any opposition on that item? There Appears to be no opposition, so I'll hand to you as the mover to speak to your motion, Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. There are aspects of large built form in residential streets that I may personally dislike and struggle with, things like bulk and site coverage, for examples. And I acknowledge the comments from the people who presented tonight opposed to this application, specifically the concerns regarding bulk and vehicle access. However, the officers have done everything possible within the regulations to achieve the outcomes before us. It's not very often that we see a list of amendments that includes the entire alphabet plus 15 landscape requirements. On balance, to not accept this application, I think runs a very high risk of the loss of those amendments that have been agreed to. So, and it's never a good idea to redesign a proposal on the run. So I support the officer's recommendations, and I note that the applicant does need to make further submissions to address some of the amendments presented, noting that the lift shaft in Amendment A is one that may well require some further work before it comes to a building permit. So on balance, I find myself in a position where I recommend the officer's recommendation to my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. As there was no opposition to that item, I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. Those against? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. So we'll move on to our next item of business this evening, item 3.2, Amendment C385 Borrow, Sepples Lane rezoning exhibition outcomes. And this will be introduced by Mr. Nick Brennan, Senior Strategic Planner. Thank you, Mr. Brennan.
Thank you, Chair. And through you, Amendment C385 proposes to rezone the land at 399 Burwood Road, Hawthorn, from Public Use Zone 6 to Commercial 1 Zone. 399 Burwood Road, Hawthorn is a council-owned car park that's also known as the Sepples Lane car park. On the 25th of July 2022, Council resolved to commence the Sepples Lane Strategic Property Project, including the rezoning and sale of the land. Authorisation to prepare and exhibit that amendment was granted on the 17th of August 2022. Exhibition was carried out from the 22nd of September to the 24th of October 2022. At the conclusion of the exhibition period, Council received a total of 38 submissions. Of these submissions, 36 were opposed to the amendment, sought changes to the amendment, or objected to the sale of the land and the loss of the car park. One submission was in support of the amendment, and one was a statement of no objection to the amendment. And I will note that since the report has been published, Council has received one additional submission, which is also of no objection. The majority of objecting submissions raised issues that are outside the scope of this planning scheme amendment. Matters raised included objections to the loss of the car parking, objections relating to the future development of the site or the design of any future building on the site, as well as the exemption from notice provisions that are within the Commercial 1 Zone. Officers are recommending that the UPDC resolve to request that the Minister for Planning appoint an independent planning panel to consider Amendment C385 and to refer all submissions to that panel for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Councillors, we have one presenter this evening, Mrs. Montserrat Pesamenti, has indicated she wishes to make a submission on this matter. We will bring you forward now, Mrs. Pesamenti, noting that you have 3 minutes to do a presentation, and I'll give you 30-second warning at the towards the end of your presentation. So, are you there, Mrs. Pesamenti?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you very much. If we can just commence with your name and your suburb,
Okay.
or
My
your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
My name is Montserrat Pesamenti. I live in Hawthorn for the last 50 years. I am the secretary of the Glenferrie Traders Association for this year. And I'm just going to say the Glenferrie Burwood Road area of Hawthorn is a busy, vital and central part of the suburb. At one time it was called the heart of Hawthorne, and it still is for business, students, residents and visitors. We are all very fortunate to have an abundance of green space, lovely old buildings, lots of schools, proximity to the city, the river, good neighborhood that in today's day and age generate activity, movement. Ideally, we would like that movement to be on foot, push bike, or the generous public transport routes that service the area. Despite all encouragement, that is not happening. So we have lots of cars. And I think after coronavirus, public transport is not used as much. The Surplus Lane car park has been a car park for a very long time. From my research, well before the 1960s, as per page 57 of the report to Council dated 25th of July 2022. The current access to the car park, or 399 Burwood Road, Surplus Lane, was purchased as part of the special rate levied for 16 years at the trader's request, costing $27,000 with possession by the City of Hawthorne on the 1st of February 1968. The council meeting took place on the 26th of July 1967. I have copies of that meeting. The officers of the report in front of you today allow 5 car spaces for the access route to a full car park of 89 spaces. That makes a joke of the intentions of our predecessors that thought with great vision for future generations' well-being and planned for the prosperity of the area of Hawthorne. As the Secretary of the Glenferrie Road Traders Association, we oppose the rezoning and future sale of the car park.
30 seconds remaining.
Thank you. The GTA need to provide, improve and compete with other centres for the centre to be viable to business. The loss of 89 car spaces will certainly impact our area in an adverse way. And as a private resident, I also object strenuously. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mrs. Pesamenti, and I do love the information that you've got from over 40 years ago. Councillors, are there any questions of Mrs. Pesamenti? There appears to be no questions. Thank you, Mrs. Pesamenti, for your presentation this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll turn to Mr. Brennan to see if there are any matters arising from Mrs. Pesamenti's presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the material that Mrs. Pesamenti has brought forth there about the purchase of the land and the special rate put on the traders is in accordance with the information that we've also found. I will acknowledge I may not have a copy of that council report, but we do have that information about the special levy on the traders purchasing or providing funds for purchasing part of that site. Council is through the Glenferrie Place plan looking to produce a number of improvements throughout the Glenferrie Centre. The sale of this land is intended to provide some funding that will aid in the other works that council wants to take place within the centre, and that will include some improved parking facilities within the centre as well. I'll also note that the traffic investigations and surveys and parking surveys that council has done are showing that the bulk of the use of this car park is through students and staff of the university, as opposed to visitors or shoppers to the shops in the centre, which is council's aim of providing car parking in the area. So it is this car park is not being used in the best way that council could be providing parking to the centre. So the aim through this rezoning, which is a small part of the larger project, is to provide improved facilities throughout the Glenferrie Centre.
We have Mr. Walker seeking to add some commentary as well.
Thanks, Chair. Just maybe just to add briefly and just to clarify that what council or what the UPDC is being asked to consider tonight is a referral of submissions for the planning scheme amendment to rezone the land to commercial one to a panel to consider whether that's the appropriate zone for the site. The council isn't considering the sale of the land this evening or what will happen or car parking issues that have been raised. So the consideration this evening is in relation to the referral or submissions to a panel. And then if that's what the UPDC decides, then that will be brought back to the UPDC to consider the panel report and recommendations. Any process related to the sale of the land will be a separate process and considerations of the relevant issues such as car parking as part of that process as well.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Precisely to clear up the officer's recommendation that's here. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? I do have a question from Councillor Galt.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Brennan, I think you've confirmed that the trader contribution or levy was applied basically to the access road, or what is properly called Circles Lane. Is there any evidence that any trader contributions went towards the bulk of the car park where the majority of vehicles are parked?
Thank you, Councillor. The investigations that we've had show that the site is made up of 6 different titles. 5 of those titles were in council ownership from the early 1900s, and the levy that was put on the traders in the 1960s was used to purchase one additional title, which is covering the access laneway. We haven't found any evidence that there was any levy put to purchase those earlier parcels of land, but we also have not found that that wasn't the case.
Chair, can I ask a couple more questions, if you don't mind?
Thank you.
The parking studies, there's been a bit of information on the predominant use by Swinburne staff and students. Have there been any more recent studies? I think there was some earlier this year, but still that might have been affected by COVID. Do we have any more updated parking use studies? And as part of that question, how do we know and how do we estimate, as part of those studies, the people parking the car, whether they're students and staff of Swinburne or whether they're shoppers or traders?
Mr. Walker.
Thanks, Chair. Perhaps I might address this issue. There is further car parking analysis that's been undertaken in the second half of this year to undertake counts within the car park, but also to assess and analyse where people that park within the car park go to. And so what that involves is actually reviewing people and observing them parking within the car park, and then tracking where their movements go to and what the destinations are at the end of those movement locations away from the car park. So there's an estimation then that's able to be arrived at in relation to where people are understood to be going to from that car park. That assessment and material is yet to be finalised, but the indications at this stage are that it confirms the earlier assessments, reports and analysis that was provided to council that majority of people parking in that car park are associated with Swinburne University.
Can I just also, Chair, ask a couple more questions? it is clear from observations on that site and the report that we actually don't charge for parking on Circles Lane car park. And I understand that a number of people parking there probably do exceed the limits that we impose through signage. Do you believe that this affects the level of use of this car park, the fact that it's free and not overly policed? I know it's a speculative answer I'm seeking in this one, but I'll pose it anyway.
Thanks, Chair. Perhaps just to indicate that the fact that this car park is a free car park that provides some opportunities for parking for longer periods of time in the day. It's certainly not all day parking, but that certainly would encourage a higher level of intense parking compared to paid parking areas. That would be a general observation.
My final question is, in those studies, and clearly there are people parking there, and even if there was charges levied, there may still be parking there by Swinburne, students, staff, but also traders and possibly people shopping in the area. Have we ever tried to observe the level of use of the multi-storey Swinburne car park, thinking of an option for those staff and students, and if it disappeared, would we drive them into the area? Has the Swinburne car park got capacity for people who may not park in this site in the future?
Again, through yourself, Chair, I think earlier reports to Council indicated that there was capacity within that Swinburne car park, and some of the further analysis is looking at that potential, that capacity within the Swinburne car park, but also the capacity within surrounding streets and other car park locations to absorb any offsetting of car parking from this particular location.
Thank you. If I could just foreshadow a motion, Chair, when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. Councillors, any further questions of our officers this evening? There appears to be none. Councillor Galt, so this is your opportunity to put forward a motion.
Thank you very much, Chair. Look, I'd like to use as the basis the officers' recommendations, but I'd like to add a further clause at the end, and I think that's been prepared by the officers today. If we could have that up on the screen, that would be fantastic.
So this is reflected in clause 7, Councillor Galt.
Yeah, if you go to the end, if you can scroll down to that, it is placed there. Would you like a moment to read that before we proceed?
Yeah, I'll just read that out for the benefit of the gallery. Item 7's been introduced. Note that the Council will fully consider and address the issues associated with any trader association contributions, in brackets, special charge or levy, towards the purchase of the car park at 399 Burwood Road, Hawthorn, and any legal obligation, in brackets, based on legal advice, close brackets, to provide replacement car parking before deciding on whether or not to sell the land in the future. And that's been added to the officer's recommendation. That's your motion, Councillor Galt?
It is indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I might just officers to drop that down so I can see all councillors. And I'm in search of a seconder to assist Councillor Galt. I've got Councillor Gillies. And is there any opposition on this item? Councillor Sinfield has posed some opposition. So I'll move to you, Councillor Galt, to speak to your motion.
Thanks very much, Chair. Whilst I understand in previous studies we've identified that council weren't getting, and shoppers and traders weren't getting a great deal of use out of this car park, they are getting some beyond Swinburne. It's also very valuable land, and I don't know if the value of the land is optimised for the use of Glenferrie strip shopping area. So I think there's a few things we need to carefully resolve if we decide. I know this is just to do with zoning tonight, but it does foreshadow a potential sale. It is shadowed in the report. And before we move forward, I'd like to think that the issues of commitments to traders or use of parking and replacement parking was resolved before we proceed with anything along those lines. So on that basis, I'd like to encourage my colleagues to support the amended motion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. Do any other councillors seek to speak to this item? Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you. I'm concerned that our inquiries reveal that the car park is primarily used by university staff and students, and this is not a new revelation to me or to us, something that we've previously discussed. I'm further concerned that we've done nothing to remedy this situation, even though they are apparently overstaying the 3P zoning of the current car park. It's yielding no revenue to us or to benefit anybody else. The council's contributing to this problem, as Mr. Brennan said in his presentation before, by not addressing the zoning of the car park so that it better suits the traders and the shoppers in the local area. Now is the time to support our traders, not a time to abandon them. They need our support now more than ever. And if we can't provide the car parking required in that area for our traders themselves or their shoppers, then people will simply go to Victoria Gardens or Westfield. And that's not what we want to support our local economy. I've been opposed to the sale of this parcel of land and the steps prior to the sale or potential sale of this parcel of land for some time, and I remain so. If it was a 1 or 2p zoned car park that would yield revenue for us or potentially provide permit-based parking for the traders, then it would be suiting their needs and not here to serve our needs without their consideration. So I think it's short-sighted to do this, particularly absent the additional information that we need. I note the additional point that Councillor Gold has added into this motion, and I thank him for that. And I know that I'll be standing here on my little island of one as I anticipate, but I think it's the right thing to do to support the traders who need us right now. So I would encourage you to consider carefully the submission of this and the motion before you, and whether in fact giving this matter for consideration of the Minister for Planning is the appropriate thing to do at this juncture. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Do any other councillors seek to speak to this before I move back to the mover? Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. My understanding of listening to the discussion around this report is that the future of the traders is at the front of our mind. And I think Councillor Gold spoke clearly about that, as I think did the planners, that we don't know where this will end, but potentially it gives us the opportunity to do something that might actually service the shoppers and the traders, whereas at the moment it seems that this isn't servicing them based on the parking surveys. So I do believe that the intent is to do the best we can for this shopping centre and to keep it thriving. That's all I want to say. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. I've got Councillor Bigger next.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Addis sort of beat me to it, but I will echo what she said in the sense that I don't think that a vote for this, I'm confident that a vote for this motion is not a vote against traders. I think that that doesn't mean we don't have to have a conversation further down the line about traders' interests and concerns and where we have parking and how we allocate things and what we prioritize. There are still conversations to be had regarding this space. And I think taking this step opens up an opportunity to have some of those really important conversations. It doesn't lock us in to a particular way forward. So I would just echo what Councillor Gold has said and Councillor Addis and say that I encourage people to, my fellow councillors, to support this as an opportunity to take a step in a direction before we then pause to ensure that that we have answered all the further questions that will arise through the course of this process, which they will. So I encourage my fellow councillors to support this recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. Any further councillors seeking to speak to this item? Otherwise, I'll hand back to our mover. Councillor Gillies, was that a hand up?
Thank you, Chair. It was sort of a hand up plus a cat pat. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I don't know if you were intending to ask the seconder to speak. If you do, I'll wait till then. Otherwise, I'll speak now.
I think, well, you're more than welcome to speak now, Councillor Gillies, if you'd like to speak now.
All right, thanks. Well, I'm on mute. Thanks. Optimization definitely needs careful consideration. Appreciate that. But to note that this isn't a commitment to sell, it's setting out the appropriate mechanisms should that be council's decision down the track, which I would anticipate would look to address the needs expressed by Councillor Sinfield and others. That's all to say. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Any further speakers? Otherwise, I will hand back to Councillor Galt.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Simply to say I agree with most of the speakers tonight. We must support our traders at this time. And I have heard from a number of traders who do use this car park, and there are some issues we've got to resolve around that. There is no doubt about that. But I continue to be convinced that this is not the best use or optimization of a very fine resource we've got before us. And as been pointed out tonight, this is only about zoning tonight, but there's a lot more discussion to take place. And we're certainly looking in great detail around what we're going to do right the way up the length of the Glen Ferry Road shopping strip, and can we provide the answers that we need as part of that exercise. So that's why we added the last clause at the end to leave some discussion space open, and I think that's the right way forward. But I think it's important to advance tonight to get this planning through to see what options we've got with regards to this great resource we've got in the surplus lane land. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? And those against? Declare that motion carried. Thank you, councillors. So move on to item 4, general business. Councillors, are there any items of general business? Before we do move on, I do have something not quite town planning wise, but I do recognise it was the Mayor's birthday last Friday. So without seeking to embarrass you, Councillor Addis, by singing happy birthday on behalf of council, we do wish you a happy birthday, albeit for last Friday. Happy birthday to you. Item 5, urgent business. Councillors, are there any items of urgent business? There being none. Item 6, confidential business. Are there any items of confidential business? There being none. So that brings us to the close of our Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting. I declare the meeting closed at 8:05 p.m. I hope everyone has a restful evening this evening. Thank you very much.